you for joining us today. We are very excited to have Noah Tuchow here at the Origin Seminar Series. Noah recently joined the Steward Observatory and my group specifically, and our Alien Earth astrobiology team to work on science questions for future exoplanet missions. This is basically a direct continuation of Noah's excellent work at the Goddard Space Flight Center. Noah received his PhD from Penn State University and then spent past 3 years at the Goddard Space Flight Center as a NASA postdoctoral fellow, where he worked with Chris Stark and the HWO team on the HWO target catalog that he will be discussing here. It's also part of the larger community effort. And he also worked on science questions for HWO, including albedo patterns in directly detectable planets. So Noah's work also includes in planets that move in and out of the habitable zone and their evolution and then contribution to detectable habitable planets. And a fun thing is that Noah is also learning languages, so he's also almost fluent in Chinese, I understand. You can test that. And,
but please don't.
Okay, so I think that you let me hand it over to Noah. We'll talk about target selection and science case simulations for the habitable.
Thanks for the introduction. As Daniel said, I'm Noah, and I'm going to be talking primarily about precursor science for the Habitable Worlds Observatory. So before we get into the actual science which I've been working on, let's do a brief review of what the Habitable Worlds Observatory is. So what is the current status of the, can't move my slides. Okay, the Habitable Worlds Observatory. So the Habitable Worlds Observatory is the next proposed large NASA flagship mission after Roman. This figure on the side is just a notional concept for HWO. It's a little bit out of date. There's actually newer concepts nowadays, but it's a space-based direct imaging mission that aims to detect and measure the spectra of Earth-sized planets in the habitable zones of sun-like stars. I'm going to refer to these in the future as exoEarths, but keep in mind that these are Earth-sized planets, and we don't yet know if they are Earth-like, and we want to measure the spectra of these Earth-sized planets and determine whether or not they're Earth-like. And so the HWO uses a next-generation chronograph instrument to block out a star's light and preserve the light of its planets. And it aims to do this in coverage from the near UV to the near IR. Essentially, we can think of, even though it's called the Habitable Worlds Observatory, I'd like to emphasize that it's not only an exoplanet observatory. It can essentially be thought of as a replacement for Hubble, or like a super Hubble or a Hubble 2.0. That's kind of what we want to portray HWO as. But one of the main science goals of HWO is habitable worlds, as it says in its name. So its main goal, at least as far as exoplanet astronomers are interested in, is characterizing the atmospheric compositions of 25 exoEarths by measuring the spectra. So HWO is currently in the early stages of formulation, and it's not really expected to launch until the early 2040s. Recent budget things may push that back a little bit further, but that was the original launch date. And mission designs are not yet finalized. This means that multiple design concepts are being explored to see whether or not it can actually meet this goal of detecting and characterizing 25 exoEarths. So HWO is nominally a 6-meter diameter mission, but we're actually exploring architectures that range from 6 to 8 meters. And we're doing these traceries and yield calculations, which are required in order to determine whether or not a mission architecture can actually achieve its science goals. So let's briefly talk about yield calculations. So yield calculations work to simulate the performance of proposed mission design and determine the number of planets which they will discover. So this requires a detailed mission simulation and also models of the detection completeness and exposure time, as well as a well-defined search strategy. These calculations take an input catalog as essentially their input, and then they output the yield of a survey and also the schedule of targets which a surveyor can observe. And past results have shown that different telescope and chronograph designs can select very different populations of stars. So this figure on the side over here is showing the target selected for a survey in terms of distance and luminosity. And this is for the same telescope, but different chronograph designs. And the points here are colored by the priority of the targets. So how good a target they are. So the highest priority targets are in red and the lowest ones are in purple. And we can see that even though the telescope's the same, because we have different chronographs, we have vastly different samples of stars that are actually selected. So in my talk, I'm going to be talking about my construction of the HWO Preliminary Input Catalog. Then we'll talk briefly about the work of the HWO Target Stars and Systems Working Group to identify high-priority HWO targets. And finally, we'll go into exoplanet science case simulation with HWO, so an example application of this input catalog that I'm developing. So first, let's talk about the Habitable Worlds Observatory Preliminary Input Catalog. As we mentioned earlier, yield calculations require a stellar target list as an input. So HWO is being designed to detect and obtain spectra for Earth analogs in the habitable zone, but this is a very challenging science problem. This requires us to get planet-star contrasts on the order of 10 to the negative 10, so 1 part in 10 billion, and angular separations on the order of 10 to 100 milliarc seconds. So we're talking about really, really faint objects really, really close to their host stars. So this is a very challenging problem, but it's not impossible. And this means that exo-Earth detection is only really possible for a relatively small sample of stars. And prior to the survey for exo-Earths, it's likely that most Earth-sized planets in the habitable zone of sun-like stars will not have been discovered. So even if we have, even if our transit spectroscopy methods are able to actually detect exo-Earths, still most exo-Earths in the solar neighborhood will not be transiting. So our survey will essentially be a blind survey. So we need to design a survey to discover these planets and characterize them. So which stars are ideal for detecting Earths around them? So we'd like to survey bright stars because we observe these planets in reflected starlight. So if the stars themselves are too faint, the planets will also be too faint. We also want to detect nearby stars because I mentioned earlier that we're constrained by the angular separation of the planet and the star. So closer stars will have a habitable zone that is a larger angular separation away from its star. And the chronograph is dictated by its inner working angle. So you need to have the habitable zone of the host star be outside the chronograph's inner working angle. We also are biased towards FGK stars. And this is because the habitable zone location is dictated by the spectral type of the host star, or equivalently, the luminosity and effective temperature. So smaller stars will have less of a severe contrast between the planet and the host star, but at the same time, their habitable zones will be located closer in. Whereas for larger stars, we kind of have the opposite problem, where the stars vastly outshine their planets, but the habitable zones are farther out and easier to image. So FGK stars happen to be the sweet spot where the planets are not too close into the star to be detectable, and also not too faint compared to their host stars to be detectable. So what are the requirements for a new input catalog? So we want an input catalog that's up to date, expansive, and complete in stellar properties. And so I mentioned earlier that different chronograph and telescope designs can significantly affect which stars are the best targets for a given direct imaging mission design. So we want an input catalog to be agnostic of telescope and chronograph design, and also be agnostic of what type of planets we're searching for. So we want an input catalog that's able to simulate a direct imaging survey for exo-Earths, but we also don't want to have a catalog that's too restricted that it couldn't simulate a search for Jupiters or something. So we'd like to develop a living catalog that's easily updatable and would be regularly expanded. Past efforts were hand curated and requires a ton of work, so we want to make something that's automatically update. So with that, we've created the HWO Preliminary Input Catalog, which I'm calling HPIC. And this is a new input catalog, which is developed starting from the TESS input catalog, the TIC, and the Gaia target lists. And as an initial starting point for these catalogs, we impose a distance cutoff at 50 parsecs. This is because realistically, beyond 50 parsecs, we're not going to be able to directly image these planets. Just the angular scale is too small. So at 50 parsecs, planet 1AU from its star would have an angular separation of just 20 milliarc seconds. And even for a 1 lambda d chronograph, which is kind of idealized, we can never really get, and it would be very difficult to actually get that far. And an 8-meter telescope observing at 1 micron, the minimum achievable angular separation would be around 26 milliarc seconds. So realistically, 50 parsecs is just too small angular scale for us to actually observe the habitable zone. So we also impose a magnitude cutoff at 12th magnitude in either the Gaia G band or the TESS T band. And this is largely due to the volume completeness of the TESS input catalog. So one can see in this plot over here that the number of objects in the TESS input catalog increases as a function of magnitude up until we get to a certain point in which case it starts going down. And that's because pass around maybe 13th magnitude or something, we don't have a full complete volume of the stars in the local neighborhood. We're incomplete to a certain extent. So cutting at 12th magnitude, make sure that we actually know the stars in the local volume down to that magnitude. And this is actually a very, very conservative cut. So realistically, past results from yield surveys suggest that if we made a cut at, say, 8th magnitude in V band, we'd still include all the targets that we'd like to survey. But this cut enables us to potentially deal with other science cases such as Jupiter detections, which might be able to extend down to more distant and fainter stars. So this is a rough flowchart for the catalog construction. I won't go into too much of the detail, but I'd note that there's certain quirks of like the test input catalog and guide that we have to take into account when we're querying them. That's why we have to query tests 3 times. We query it for the nearby objects, but also for the bright objects. So one problem with we found in the test input catalog is that some bright objects don't have distances listed, and also some objects have incorrectly calculated test magnitudes. So we have a kind of a sanity check, just the very, very brightest objects, we select them in J magnitude also to make sure that they're present in the catalog. And we combine our sample of test nearby and bright objects and Gaia DO3 objects, and we apply our magnitude cuts. And then we also gather distances for the objects that are missing distances and apply a distance cut. And that's how we form the foundation of our input catalog. So we have additional problems that we need to take into consideration. One of the main things is that many objects in the test input catalog and Gaia DO3 target lists are the same objects. So we did very careful cross-matching of objects based on identifiers as well as positions and photometry. And there's also the problem where the test input catalog lists Gaia IDs, but it lists the Gaia DO2 IDs because those were the most current Gaia IDs when the test input catalog was constructed. So we had to do cross-matching between Gaia DO2 and Gaia DO3, which are not the same IDs in those catalogs. We also made sure to remove duplicate objects and artifacts and background galaxies that were tagged by test and Gaia. And we also identify binaries using the Washington double star and Gaia catalog of nearby stars. And so if we have 2 separate objects in the binary, we have to make sure to drop the combined source so that we don't double count our binaries. So with that, we've constructed the HWO Preliminary Input Catalog, which includes roughly 13,000 bright nearby objects. That's kind of a rough plot of them in distance and luminosity space. And our next step was to gather stellar measurements for them and derive astrophysical properties for them using an automated pipeline. So we've developed an automated pipeline for obtaining stellar properties for these stars. And for each stellar property, we determine which literature source to use, whether we calculate it ourselves or whether or not we get it from literature value. And so we aim for the highest. Sorry, sorry, there was something popped up on my screen. So we aim for the highest completeness in stellar properties while also ensuring that the values are self-consistent and accurate. So this plot on the side over here is just showing an example kind of flowchart. Well, it's not really flowchart. We had another figure for a flowchart, but I didn't include that in the presentation. But this is showing for a given property such as effective temperature, we have a whole list of different sources that we select from, and we prioritize them according to a prioritization scheme. So let me see. Yeah, and we also prioritize the properties that are necessary for yield calculations of photometry across the HWO wavelength range. So this is showing the contents of our catalog. Like here we show the astrophysical and photometry in our catalog, the number of objects that have that measurement, and the completeness, like what % of these objects have that measurement. So we focus primarily on like the properties for yield calculations such as distance and luminosity, and also the masses and photometry in the Johnson bands and the Gaia bands and the 2-mass JHK bands. And we also include properties such as positions, proper motion, parallax, binarity, and also whether or not there's nearby bright stars that could potentially contaminate the image. We find that we have pretty high completeness for most of these properties. There's some properties which, I mean, everyone wants ages, but ages are really hard to get. So we have, I mean, I'd say having a third of the stars in the catalog with ages is actually not that bad. But whether or not you can trust those ages is another story. So we'd like to determine whether or not these properties are reliable, like whether or not the properties that came from an automated pipeline are actually usable and reliable. So we compare it to another source that wasn't used in catalog construction. This is another target list for HWO, which is the NASA Exoplanet Exploration Program HWO mission stars list, which they work to gather the 160 or so best direct imaging targets for HWO. This is a hand-curated list of the most accessible stars for direct imaging based on the contrast and angular separation. So why didn't we just use this as an input catalog? The reason why we didn't use this as an input catalog is that this is actually much fewer than the number of stars which HWO will actually survey. This is the best stars within the HWO survey that would have potentially the lowest exposure times. But in order to actually simulate all these HWO surveys, we need to start from a large target list and have the yield calculation narrow it down to a smaller target list. So the smaller target list that the HWO yield calculations would narrow it down to would be around 200 to 400 stars. So still larger than this list, but this gives a good point of measurement for the precise stellar properties for these very, very best HWO targets. So we'll compare our values using an automated pipeline to their values, which are created by hand. And so this is a comparison of our pipeline to their pipeline. We have our values on the x-axis, their values on the y-axis, and we can see that it's very, very close to a one-to-one relation. There's some spread on these plots due to like just the intrinsic uncertainty in these measurements, and also for the case of log G's, there's a bit of confusion in there just because log G's derived from spectroscopy are different, tend to be different from log G's that are derived from just inferred based off the star's bulk properties. So if you have the mass and the radius of the star and use that to compute the surface gravity, it's going to be different than when you compute just by looking at spectra. But overall, we're satisfied with it's very close to a one-to-one relation for all these properties. So as an overview of our input catalog, we've created an input catalog that has around 13,000 direct imaging target stars for HWO trade studies, and we're gathering and computing accurate stellar properties for each one of them. And this catalog gathers the properties of these bright stars, and it'll be useful for many different areas of exoplanetary and stellar astrophysics, not only direct imaging. So essentially, if you want to know the properties of nearby bright stars, then this can be used. It's not only for direct imaging. So HWO is being used for trade studies and yield calculations right now, and it's publicly available on the NASA Exoplanet Archive. And yeah, I mentioned it's being used by mobile teams researchers. And it's a living catalog that'll be regularly updated and expanded. So say Gaia DR4 comes out, it's relatively trivial to ingest Gaia DR4 into this catalog and get updated distances and other properties from Gaia DR4. So in the next part of my talk, I'd like to talk about our work on expanding on this input catalog. So identifying the targets that are most likely to be observed by HWO. I mentioned the work of the NASA Exoplanet Exploration Program, and this part of the talk is kind of hybridizing my target list and their target list, and also the results of yield calculations, and trying to identify what targets are most likely to be observed by HWO, and also what stellar property measurements do we need. And so this was actually a larger collaboration working with the HWO Target Stars and Systems Working Group, which this was a group that was founded shortly after I developed the first version of this input catalog. And this is a group organized by the HWO project office that's focused on identifying and characterizing the targets for HWO's exoEarth survey. And it focuses on evaluating the state of our knowledge of their stellar properties and determining what precursor observations are required. So what observations are required before HWO's design is finalized and also before HWO launches. And this is a large catalog that's divided into several groups, but I'm going to be focusing primarily on the catalogs and databases group, which I led, alongside co-leads Eric Mamajek, and Jill and Caleb. And I'm going to be focusing on it, and this group focused on identifying what population of stars are potential targets for HWO and which stars require precursor observations. So as a result of this working group, we constructed a new target list, which is essentially an expansion of the HPIC, which is the HWO Target Stars and Systems TSS 25 target list. And this is a prioritized list of potential HWO targets that builds off of existing target lists and databases. I mentioned we're kind of hybridizing the HPIC and the XEP list, as well as using the result of yield calculations. So in this list, we focus on developing different tiers of targets. So we start with tier 1, which are the best targets for HWO. Best is subjective, but I'll talk about what we determine to be best. And then tier 2 is the objects that are actually going to be likely to be surveyed by HWO. So objects, HWO doesn't have a finalized design, so it's a little bit, we have to be careful with our assumptions about which objects are going to be likely to surveyed by HWO, but tier 2 is trying to identify the likely HWO targets. And tier 3 is all nearby bright objects that could be potential HWO targets. So let's talk about how we develop tier 1. So tier 1 is stars with the most accessible Habitable zones for direct imaging of exoEarths. So these are targets requiring the shortest exposure times to characterize exoEarth atmospheres. So the exposure time required to actually get a high enough signal to noise spectrum of an Earth-like planet's atmosphere in reflected light can vary drastically based on host stars types. So this can be hours for the best targets to weeks for the maximum observable targets. And so these tier 1 objects are essentially the low-hanging fruit with the shortest exposure time. And these will actually contribute potentially the largest portion of the mission's yield of exoplanets and potentially the largest portion of its science yield. And so yeah, these are the stars with the shortest exposure times, the highest probability of hosting technical exoEarths in reflected light. And so for tier 1, we use the XEP mission stars list, which determined which stars had the shortest exposure times and were the most accessible. This is a list of around 164 stars. So much of our work in this group was focused on identifying tier 2, which is the plausible targets for HWO. So as I mentioned earlier, HWO will likely observe more than just the 164 tier 1 stars. And past yield surveys have suggested that it's probably somewhere between 200 and 400 stars surveyed over the course of a 2-year mission. And different mission designs will prefer vastly different populations of target stars. So there's a large trade space of possible HWO designs. And these vary in diameter between, say, 6 to 8 meters. And they also differ in terms of chronograph design, the detectors they employ, and also just the architecture of the spacecraft. And so we'd like, so we want to identify the population of targets that will be observed by HWO, but we don't want to make too many assumptions about HWO's mission design, since we notice that the population of targets that HWO can observe varies a lot based on mission architecture. So to do this, we can use the outputs from yield calculations spanning the trade space that's currently under consideration for HWO. So these yield calculations input like the HPIC or another input catalog, and output a list of targets that the mission observes. So we can use these yield calculations to find an overlapping space of which objects are selected for survey. So our group was provided with the results of 2 sets of yield calculations using different yield codes. So the first set of yield calculations that we use are from Stark et al. 2024. And these are yield calculations that define an edge case for different HWO designs. So one of these yield calculations is focusing on an 8-meter telescope, so an 8-meter telescope along the same design as the earlier Louvre B concept. And then the other one is a 6-meter telescope, but with a large series of design trades to make it like the maximum efficiency that you'd possibly get for a 6-meter telescope. And these are in distance and luminosity space, and they're color-coded because these simulations were repeated 1,000 times, and we color-code them based on the fraction of simulations in which a given star was selected. So the yellow stars were selected for almost every simulation, and the purple ones might have only been selected for a few simulations out of the larger ensemble. And so we were also provided with another set of yield calculations from Morgan et al. 2024. And this is an ensemble of yield calculations that span a range of telescope diameters, chronograph parameters, and detection band passes. And it's a grid of a bunch of different design scenarios, and for each design scenario, they run it 100 times. So essentially, we have 35,000 simulations here. And in this plot, we can notice that we're also plotting distance and luminosity, but we're plotting here the average yield per star, like average over all these simulations. And if you're curious about the 30 magnitude line over here, that's because this yield calculation used the earlier input catalog, which was cut off at 30 parsecs, but the HWO Preliminary Input Catalog, which is in gray over there, sends out to 50. So using these two input catalogs, we'd like to identify the high priority objects, but just combining all of the stars in these two calculations results in many outliers that are really selected with a low yield per star. So say if a star was selected for 1 out of 1,000 times, it would still be in this catalog. So we want to make sure to get rid of these outliers. And we want a reasonably sized target list that we could potentially go through by hand to make sure that we actually have decent measurements. So we select the top 90% of objects in the two star-all yield simulations in terms of count rates, and then the top 90% objects in the Morgan et al. Simulation grid based off of the average yield per star. I mean, they define some property called panchromatic yield metric, which is essentially an average over the different wavelengths that they're detecting in. So average over IR, visible, and UV. And we take the union of these two target lists. And then we define our tier 2 as all the objects in this combined list of likely HWO targets that aren't already in tier 1. Finally, we define tier 3, which is essentially all other potential HWO targets. So we select the stars in the HPIC that weren't included in tiers 1 or 2. And these are nearby bright stars, which are probably unlikely to be selected for exo-Earth direct imaging, but they could be good targets for direct imaging of other planet types, such as Jupiter analogs. And these tier 3 stars, as I mentioned before, are required as an input for yield calculations. So we need to know their stellar properties, but we don't necessarily need them to as precise as the stellar properties for the stars that HWO is likely to observe. So this is a overview of the targets in our different tiers. As we can see, as you get down to higher and higher tiers, you get to a narrower and narrower region of parameter space where we get nearby bright FGK stars in this red over here. And then the tier 2 stars extend out to farther distances and also potentially fainter or brighter stars. And then essentially tier 3 covers the entire parameter space of all stars within 50 parsecs. And also want to note that in the region where most of the tier 1 stars are, there are a few tier 2 stars, and that's largely due to binarity. So if you have a host star which has a binary companion nearby, that could potentially lower its quality in terms of being a direct imaging target, because that binary could contaminate the image in terms of direct imaging, making it harder to track out the star's light. And this is also an overview of these objects in terms of their V magnitudes. And we can see that the tier 1 objects are the brightest objects. Tier 2 objects are still pretty bright, and then tier 3 objects are essentially go all the way down to 12 magnitude. So our prioritized list of HWO targets was provided to the larger Target and Systems Working Group. And these other task groups identified what stellar measurements were required for objects in each tier and what precision was needed. And our paper on this target list was recently published, and the catalog is on Vizier right now. So this is the HWO Target Size and Systems 2025 list, and we're hoping that this is going to be a continually updated list so that there will be a 2026 version and 2027 version as our knowledge of these HWO target stars evolves, and potentially some stars that are thought to be tier 1 targets might be moved into tier 2, some tier 2 targets might be moved up to tier 1, depending on our precursor observations of that. So in this last part of the talk, how am I doing for time? Okay, I'm doing pretty well. Okay, so in the last part of this talk, I want to talk about exoplanet science case simulation with HWO. So this is a potential example application of the yield target list that we developed. And I'd like to focus on specifically comparative exoplanetology. So what can we learn about planets at a population level? And this is a project that's more in line with what I'm currently working on with Daniel's group. And this is actually a collaboration with Daniel's group last year. So essentially for this project, I want to focus on what we can learn about planet populations using HWO. So set several example science cases which we'd like to study with HWO, such as understanding planetary habitability, identifying signs of life on other planets, and identifying statistical biosignatures, and also testing our theories of planetary formation. I'm going to focus primarily on testing the concept of the habitable zone with HWO. So HWO wants to be able to give empirical constraints in the habitable zone, and I want to determine how what the performance of proposed HWO designs would be with regards to this science case. So for this specific problem, we'll focus on trends in planetary albedo as a function of installation. So the classical picture of the Habitable Zone predicts that planets in the Habitable Zone will actually have lower albedos than planets outside of it. That's a little bit counterintuitive, but if you think about the Habitable Zone, planets interior to the Habitable Zone are likely to have thick runaway greenhouse atmospheres that are very reflective. And planets exterior to the Habitable Zone are likely to be globally glaciated and also very reflective. So planets in the Habitable Zone, just by virtue of not being in one of these runaway states, are lower reflectivity and lower albedo than planets outside the Habitable Zone. So HWO will directly measure planet-star contrast, and planet-star contrast is directly proportional to albedo, as seen as this equation over here. It's also related to the radius of the planet squared and the illumination phase of the planet. So this is some math. I don't need to get into too much detail, but if you rearrange the equation in terms of installation, you find that contrast is also directly proportional to installation. And we can't measure albedo by itself because it's intertwined with these radius and phase function, but we can define this property, which I'm calling beta over here, which is essentially a normalized contrast, which is the closest that we can get to directly measuring albedo. So contrast and angular separation will be directly measurable from planet detections alone, and this doesn't require spectral characterization. So one could feasibly think that HWO requires a certain amount of exposure time to get a detection of a planet, and then much more exposure time to get actual a high spectral noise spectrum of planet. And these can be done with the detection alone and not necessarily a high spectral noise spectrum. So potentially grants us a larger sample size and allows us to make more inferences about the population. So let's talk about the trends in albedo that we're going to be introducing. So we want to find these trends in albedo in planet brightnesses and separation. And the albedo distribution of planets in the Habitable Zone is fundamentally unknown, and it's one of the things that HWO would like to actually determine. But we can inject trends in albedo and determine whether or not HWO would actually be able to recover them. So we want to know whether or not HWO can empirically constrain the Habitable Zone based on the albedo distribution and what the sample size of planets is needed to actually detect a trend and what the minimum strength of a trend would be needed. So to do this, we use the bioverse statistical comparative planetology code to simulate a proposed HWO mission design. So we inject a trend in albedo, and we've modified the mission design and survey strategy to be more consistent with current HWO design concepts. So we use the HPIC as an input catalog, and we're using an 8-meter design that's similar to the proposed LUFOB design. And we determine whether or not these simulated planets are detectable, whether or not the injected trends are recoverable. So essentially, we simulate an entire population of planets with a trend injected and try to determine whether or not that trend can be, try to determine whether or not those planets can be discovered and whether or not the discovered planets can be found to have strong evidence of actually hosting that trend. And we can freely adjust the strength of trend, the telescope and chronograph properties, and also the sample size of planets that we're interested in. So for injected trends, we'll just use a toy model for trends in albedo. As I mentioned before, we don't really know what the albedo distribution in the Habitable Zone will be. So this is just essentially, if we inject a function in albedo, can we detect it in the output? And we want to know how strong that function will be and how many planets are needed to detect it. So we use a step function that's in the Habitable Zone. So it's a lower value in the Habitable Zone and another value if it's outside the Habitable Zone. And we have a null hypothesis where there's no trend in the Habitable Zone. So this is results for an example calculation using an 8-meter LUFOB design, observing at 550 nanometers. And here we have the effective installation or the amount of flux that a planet receives on the x-axis and this normalized contrast on the y-axis. And we can see that our injected trend in albedo, where it's lower in the Habitable Zone, is reflected in this plot by this dip over here. And this example calculation has a yield of 44 planets in the Habitable Zone, but also many more planets outside the Habitable Zone. And actually detecting this trend depends on detecting planets outside the Habitable Zone, because you need to be able to see that planets outside the Habitable Zone are different than planets in the Habitable Zone. If we only had Habitable Zone planets, we wouldn't have anything to compare them to. And also on the side here, we just see the different components that go into this calculation, because this property beta is the product of these properties. So we can see that our injected trend is an idealistic step function but the radius and phase angle distributions reflect the biases of the direct imaging technique. So let's talk briefly. So on the past slide, I gave you the example of one calculation, but this is based off of random number generation. So realistically, the results for individual simulations can vary substantially between runs. So this means that different numbers of planets can be detected, and there could be stronger or weaker evidence for an albedo trend. So we want to be able to control the sample size. So in order to do this, we construct what we call a survey distribution, which essentially combines the results for 1,000 different simulated universes. And this gives a distribution of planets that HWO is likely to detect. And we draw a specific number of planets from the distribution. So here's an example of what the survey distribution looks like when we have no trend in albedo versus if we have a very strong trend in albedo. So for the very strong trend in albedo, we can observe a clear dip in the Habitable zone. And also we get some features over here that are relevant to the biases of the direct imaging method. So for instance, beyond this point, so this is log S effective, which is the flux that the planet receives. So actually larger fluxes on this side correspond to closer to the stars. So it's limited by the inner working angle on this side, and it's limited by the maximum achievable contrast on this side. And one can see that there's a clear difference between these different simulated distributions of planets. And we'd like to be able to determine, so the problem that we're having is we have a sample of points in installation and contrast, essentially. We want to determine whether or not they're consistent with a population with an underlying trend or a population with no trend. So if we have, say, this set of points, can we say that this set of points came from this distribution or this distribution? So to do this, we take a Bayesian approach and compute the marginal likelihoods for both models and calculate the Bayes factor. So this is an analysis of an example scenario. Here we show the Bayes factor calculated for 10,000 different simulations. So some simulations give a very, very statistically significant result, while other ones don't, and we want to compute the statistical power. So in order to do that, we look at a single simulation where we have 25 exoEarth candidates and a strong trend in albedo. So albedo is 0.4 lower in the Habitable zone than it is outside, which is probably too strong, but we'll get into that. And we compute the statistical power using the true positive rate, where the Bayes factor is greater than a certain value. Here we're using 10 on the Jeffreys scale. And we can see in this plot over here that the blue points represent points generated when there is a true trend in albedo, and the points on this side of the threshold curve represent the true positive rate, where a trend is injected and a trend is recovered. So that gives a true positive rate of 92%. And then over here, these orange points are points where there's no trend injected. And then this tiny tail over here is the points where there's no trend injected and a trend is detected. So that's a false positive rate. And a false positive rate in the simulation is 0.52%. So we essentially redo this calculation for a grid of trend strengths and also sample sizes. So over here is the trend strength is on the x-axis, and the number of exoEarths we detect is on the y-axis. And one can find the minimum sample size one needs in order to get a high statistical confidence. So this contour over here is for 95% statistical confidence, and we can 95% statistical power. And we can see that we need a sample size of around 20 to 30 exoEarths. And then also over here, we characterize the false positive rate, where we notice that in the regions where we get a 95% statistical power, we don't have very high false positive rates at all, so like less than 1%. But in certain other regions of parameter space, you can get a false positive rate that's up to 50%. So yeah, I think I've mentioned the findings of this, but the required sample size increases as we decrease the strength of the trend in albedo. And sample sizes of 20 to 30 exoEarth candidates are potentially achievable, given currently considered HWO design trades. So that's a feasible yield for currently considered HWO designs. And detecting trends in albedo to empirically constrain the Habitable zone is on the edge of feasibility for HWO. So this sample size is achievable if the trends are really, really strong. If the trends are weaker, then you require much larger sample sizes. So it's a potentially achievable problem, but depending on the underlying distribution of albedos. So we don't necessarily know that yet, and that's one of the things that we hope to measure with HWO. So this could potentially be achievable if trends are strong. So in summary, this example demonstrates our ability to simulate the science output of HWO-like mission designs. And we can inject population-level trends such as a albedo trend in the Habitable zone. And we can change the strength of the injected trend, the observatory properties, and the amount of noise that we inject in the simulation. And we can measure the sample size required to detect this trend. And our bioverse framework can be used to simulate many science questions for HWO beyond this specific example. I gave the example of also biosignature searches or planet formation examples. So it's a generalized framework that's been applied to this problem, but it's not only for this problem. And it can also be used to simulate potentially other types of future missions, like we're looking into future transit spectroscopy missions also using this framework. So in conclusion, before we finalize the design for HWO, we need to make sure that HWO's design is actually able to meet its science goals. So I mentioned detecting 25 exoEarth candidates from the main science goals that HWO is being designed for. So in order to do this, we need to do trade studies, and these trade studies require an input catalog. So we've constructed the HPIC, which contains all nearby bright stars that are potential targets. And this input catalog is publicly available on the NASA Exoplanet Archive, and also NASA has a hosting service called EMAC. And we worked alongside the HWO Target Size and Systems Working Group to identify the highest priority targets for HWO, which targets likely to be selected for an HWO survey. And this target list has been recently published and hosted on Vizier. And we've adapted, and as an example application of this new target list, we adapted the bioverse framework to simulate the science output of HWO. And so we've shown that HWO may be able to empirically constrain the Habitable zone using planetary albedos, provided that the underlying trends in albedo are strong enough. So with that, I'll take any questions. Sure.
Very nice talk. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is very cool, promising idea for testing this hypothesis about albedo. I wonder if we detect this trend, or like after observing HWO targets, can you imagine like using some of the spectral data to go back and strengthen maybe this trend if you detect it or don't detect it?
Yes. Yeah, so there's kind of a trade-off with using spectral. Well, spectral information can definitely help us. There's kind of a trade-off versus using detections versus characterizations of exoplanets. Detections, you have much larger sample size, but much less information per detection. Whereas spectral information, you could eventually get direct constraints on albedo by from a spectral retrieval. But on the other hand, there's probably only as much smaller sample of planets where you can actually get retrieved precise albedos for them. So whether or not that increased fidelity of albedo measurements versus the smaller sample size gives you an advantage is an open question that we hope to study in the future.
I'm curious on the living catalog you mentioned. So are you going to just automatically updating them using any pipeline on the website? I like the exoplanet website NASA is running, or it's actually need somebody to look again the Gaia, for example, the DR4, DR5 in the future and to update.
I think it needs someone to do it, but we have the pipeline so that someone can do it more easily than just remaking it from scratch and stuff. Like so I wouldn't trust an automated pipeline if it was just injecting stuff from Gaia DR4 and not taking into account like maybe Gaia DR4 has some biases or something. So want to have a human that creates the pipeline, but don't want to have a human that looks at every star individually by hand, because that's a little bit too intensive for a very large target list.
Thank you.
Everett, would you like to speak up your question? You can unmute.
Sure. Yeah, this is really. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering. I was thinking about the albedo of polar caps, and wondering like if you would concentrate on edge-on systems, or maybe it's like statistically account for the angle, the inclination effects?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess the direct imaging method will be biased towards stars that are directly like planet star systems where you're viewing it directly overhead. So if the planet obliquity is aligned with like the ecliptic plane and stuff, then you would expect to potentially be looking at more polar caps. So that could potentially dampen the trend in albedo that you detect. If you're, say, trying to separate Earths versus snowball Earths, it might be difficult to detect them if you're only seeing the polar caps of Earth-like planets compared to polar caps of snowball Earths. Yeah, so that's an interesting consideration which I haven't really thought about, but it's worth looking into.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question. So when during the time the Earth had higher albedo, was it more habitable or less habitable? I'm wondering if the albedo has a correlation with the habitability. You would consider what's going on during that time when the albedo is high. Is it going to be, are they going to have ice age, or are they going to have?
That's a good consideration. Actually, I was looking into this. I don't think that there have been that many I don't think anyone's made a plot of Earth's albedo through time and stuff. So it's kind of difficult to so individual simulations might give like Earth's albedo at a given moment in the Okean or something, like for a given model of the Okean, maybe get Earth's albedo. But it's interesting to consider how Earth's albedo changes in time, whether or not that corresponds with habitable periods. I think in terms of either if you have a globally glaciated Earth that's high albedo, if you have really, really thick, like very, very thick atmosphere, like say an early Okean stuff, but whether that makes it less habitable, I'm not sure if that's it. Yeah, I need to actually
Well,
think
if
into
it's a
that.
really thick atmosphere, could be
Yeah.
have a problem with the greenhouse effect.
Yeah.
But then there is time that it will be high.
I guess you know
Just
what
like we did.
Yeah.
In the past.
I guess
So habitability, so you may be biased toward less habitable planets, or
oh yeah, potentially actually so HWO will probably be biased towards snowball Earths because
Yeah,
snowball Earths
right.
are more reflective, which I find that to be an interesting science case, but other people kind of want to find that actually
it's easier to detect them.
like temperate exoEarths. But I think it's interesting to, if we had a large sample of snowball Earths, we'd be able to learn a lot about like climate cycles on other exoplanets. So I think that's super interesting. But I think the general astrophysics community is searching for surface liquid water. So yeah.
I was wondering how much overlap do you expect to be between the tier 1 targets you identify and targets that are accessible to the ground-based telescopes like ELT and GMT?
I think I think that all of the tier 1 targets should be accessible to like the ground-based. I mean, there might be some hemispheric considerations when you're talking about ground-based, like I think a lot of the good targets are in the southern hemisphere and stuff, but we have good facilities in the southern hemisphere. But I mean, these are really, really bright stars that have been studied in the past, and actually a lot of these stars are too bright for Gaia, so we actually have a little bit of a lapse of survey data on them just because they've been too bright, so surveys tend to avoid them. But for ground-based telescopes, assuming that you can actually image very bright objects, they're pretty good targets, and actually we're trying to get precursor campaigns funded in order to like get further information about them, like see whether or not they host giant planets or like characterize stellar activity or various other like precisely constrain their masses and ages. So it's an area that we hope to do in the future is these precursor observations of these very, very bright potential HWO targets that would require the least amount of exposure time.
I'm wondering what fraction of them may be suitable for ground-based detection of the Earth-sized planets. So how much of the discovery space of HWO is actually potentially covered by the ground-based telescopes?
I think the reason why we're doing it from space is just because of the contrast levels which we have to get down to are very hard to achieve through the atmosphere. Actually, we're not even sure if we could be able to achieve them through the atmosphere, because you have to. So essentially, it relies a lot on the internal stability and thermal stability of the coronagraph which you're using. And even for a space-based image, you have to have a very, very carefully designed coronagraph in order to get 1 part in 10 billion contrast. So this means that we're actually doing what is essentially adaptive optics in space. We have a deformable mirror on a coronagraph to correct for tiny aberrations in like the wavefront area that's coming into the coronagraph. So from the ground, it makes it exponentially harder because it's going through the atmosphere. So we can actually do giant planet direct imaging through the atmosphere from the ground. But I think that for sun-like stars is going to be more difficult. I think the real advantage for ground-based telescopes is the larger aperture size. So it'll make direct imaging for planets around M dwarfs much more achievable. So one can conceivably get the contrast necessary to get Earths around M dwarfs using the ground-based ELTs, and we have a larger aperture than we could realistically expect to get in space. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed like way earlier that you said that you were looking at just FG and K stars. I was curious that as you looked through like the tier 1 and tier 2 list, were you looking at like were you finding stars that had more of a stellar type advantage when you were looking through the tiers?
Yes. So if you see this plot, tier 1 is essentially corresponding to luminosities that are between like FGK types, and there's actually a few M stars in there. And Eric Mamajek, my collaborator, likes to say that if an M star is on a target list, it means that it was found by a French astronomer in the 1800s. So if French astronomers can find it in the 1800s, then it can be observed by HWO. So there's not that many M dwarfs like that, but there's a few of them. So I think Proxima Centauri is in there. So it has to be very nearby to get the angular scale necessary to see the habitable zone. But as we go out to these other direct imaging targets, you can eventually get more M dwarfs and even some like potentially like earlier F stars. Well, yeah. And then you can get out to further distances also. So the spectral type advantage, I'd say FGK stars happens to be what we're interested in, but it's also what we're biased towards. So it's kind of a bonus.
Are you planning on doing any kind of like version 2, et cetera, of your HPIC after some of the HWO design parameters get nailed down?
Yeah, I mean, we're planning to update it in the future as like new data releases are released and as we get a better understanding about what HWO's design is going to be. I think for these new HWO designs, it doesn't really matter the input catalog. The input catalog is more sensitive to what the state of our knowledge about these new bi-stars change. So potentially for these new HWO designs, we want to be able to run yield calculations for them using the HPIC, and we want to make sure that the HPIC is updated to a current state of knowledge about these new bi-stars. But for the tiers of the HWO target list, we're going to be updating it based off of our design concepts. So potentially the overlapping parameter space in tier 2 might get narrower as we better understand which stars the HWO design that's finally selected is going to look at.
Okay, well, thanks again very much. We'll do